Okay, can you hear me? Can you hear me at the back? No, really. Hello? Yeah, that should be better. Okay, let's do this. Just checking that you can hear me at the back. There were some issues with the microphone. Okay, great, brilliant. All right, thanks for coming back. So this is my final lecture with you. I might see some of you in a couple of years' time, once you get to your honors courses. We have a course on public participation in democracy, where we go deeper into some of the stuff that I'm going to present to you today. But one of the reasons I really wanted to make sure that you get a chance to hear some of the things you're going to be hearing today at this stage of your studies is because for a lot of people, politics is a very narrow set of practices. And there are a lot of political practices that are under the radar. You won't see them in the 6 p.m. news or in your Instagram feed because it's an emerging field. It's what we call the field of democratic innovation. So my hope is that at least some of you will think, well, maybe this is the kind of stuff I want to look into, because if you are planning to be a civil servant or a politician or a community organizer or an activist or work for a transnational organization or institution or work in any kind of capacity that has to do with political life, with politics, with governance, with democracy, increasingly it's going to be important to understand that democracy is more than electoral democracy and politics is more than party politics. And hopefully by the end of the session today, you will see what I mean by that. And for those of you who have never come across the field of democratic innovation, maybe this might give you alternative pathways for the way you build your career. So let's see where we land with this, and let's see what you make of it. I'm going to start with the bad news, because there are bad news and good news. The bad news is that the state of democracy globally is probably at its worst since probably 70 years ago. And the good news, though, is that with these issues and these problems and this democratic recession, there is also a window of action to try and reform our institutions, our political processes, the way we think about citizens, about communities, about institutions, so that we can imagine a democracy that is fit for purpose in the 21st century, rather than a democracy that keeps declining into inexistence. So we're going to talk a little bit about the democratic recession. Then we're going to think a little bit about different dimensions of democracy. Then I'm going to bring you to the field of democratic innovation. I'm going to give you examples from different parts of the world. This is a field that doesn't belong to any single continent. Every continent and most countries, even authoritarian countries, have been experimenting with some of the processes that I'm going to share with you. And then it will be up to you to figure out whether you see potential in this space and in this field, and whether this is something that you might want to add to your range of interests that you carry over the next few years. Part of it depends on your own assessment of where we are with democracy. Whether you think that democracy is working well for everyone, whether you think that it's including everyone, whether you think that participating in democracy is an option that most citizens get access to, whether you think that we are managing to put in place the correct policies, the right approaches to solve some of the problems that we face. So depending on your diagnosis, if you think that the status quo is fine, you probably won't see the potential of the field of democratic innovation. If you think that the status quo is not fine, and probably we're in dire trouble, especially over the next 20, 30 years, then probably you will want to find a field where practice is trying to change things around. Of course, that change can come through social movements. It can come through struggles on the streets, in workplaces. It can come through traditional institutions and political parties. But a lot of people are very disillusioned with those channels. More and more people are skeptical of whether those channels are up to the task of what we are facing over the next few decades. So that is the motivation for the field of democratic innovation. Now, one of the things that is quite remarkable about the moment we find ourselves in. And this is very different from 100 years ago. So 100 years ago, there was also a global democratic recession. There were less democracies already back then, but nonetheless, there was a period of democratic recession. And a lot of the authoritarian forces that were coming through, fascist forces, totalitarian communist forces, a lot of those forces tended to use either violence or military force of some kind to take over power. That's the way authoritarianism came through. That's not how our democracies get into trouble these days. Authoritarianism in our world today, in October 2025, is coming through the very institutions of democracy that we have created to try and protect us against authoritarianism. So authoritarian leaders, authoritarian movements have learned how to use existing institutions to get to power and then change things in authoritarian directions. So it's no longer military coups. Yep. Okay. Yeah, it's a fair point, but how many more fascist movements you can think of that took power through democratic means? Certainly not Franco or Mussolini, right? So yeah, it's true, Hitler used democratic institutions to get to power, but you cannot separate that from the campaigns of violence and intimidation that were going on in parallel through paramilitary means, right? So anyway, but the point is not, the point is to say, today, if you want to watch out for dictators taking over, for potential authoritarians taking over, you don't watch out just for the military, although that still happens, or coup d'etats, although that still happens. You watch out for how existing institutions are being perversed and kind of subverted from the inside. And it has a lot to do with the type of democracies we have built, where these are elite-driven democracies. So all you need to do to topple them is to attack the top, take over the top. Because if it's an elite-driven democracy, all you need to do is to change the existing elite for a new elite. Now, if democracy is something else, if democracy is something that lives across society, in the way we live with each other, in our workplaces, in our neighborhoods, then that democracy is harder to topple. So that's the argument I'm going to put to you. Because it's a democracy that is based on distributed capacity across networks in society, not just in elite-driven bodies and organisms. Now, if you want to kind of get a sense of why we find ourselves in a democratic recession, there are many factors we could look into. But the trends are quite clear. And this has been happening now for 15, 20 years. Obviously, the financial crash in 2008 was a key moment, although some of these trends were already ongoing, rising inequalities and so on. But we find ourselves at a moment where we have lost more democratic systems just in the last 15 years than we had gained in the previous 30. And that hadn't happened before. We also find ourselves at a moment where, by some accounts, only 6% of the world population live in a full democracy. A lot of countries that we used to consider democratic no longer kind of make it to that top part of that particular ranking, the democracy index. We also have a surge in autocracies, especially in the last 20 years. Around 40% of the world's population lives under authoritarian rule. Although we also need to look at the reaction. There is a growth as well in pro-democratic movements. Now, you would be mistaken if you think that this means that people don't like or want democracy anymore. You will be mistaken because global surveys, opinion surveys, and attitude surveys globally still show that most people do value the principles of democracy, and most people appreciate the foundations of what a democracy is meant to be and do. What people are disappointed with is how democracy is being practiced. The kind of institutions that are meant to channel democratic forms of governance, the way we organize our political life and our policy making. So part of it as well is this idea of the participation gap, which is something that Dalton has mapped across the world, where he talks about a growing gap between the politically rich and the politically poor. The politically rich are those who know how to use existing spaces of power and existing opportunities to influence those spaces. And those who are politically poor do not know, are just excluded from those structures and decision-making processes. Some of the stuff that we touched on Monday. So the case for democratic innovation that has been now made for the last 20, 25, 30 years, but particularly in the last 10 years, is a very simple lesson from the history of democracy. When democracies stop evolving, they tend to start declining. Democracies can never stop developing. That's because it's just an intrinsic part of democratic life. Democracy is based on the idea that we all have a part in shaping our collective future, the decisions that affect our lives. So that changes. Society changes, and with that, the institutions that serve society. And if society evolves and changes, naturally democracy has to change, because democracy should be driven by people's aspirations, needs, and priorities. So democracy is an ongoing, evolving, never-ending project. But in many places around the world today, political elites think that this is it. This is the form of democracy. This is the best version of it, and it doesn't need to change. Whereas others are arguing, well, if that's the case, then we're in trouble, because democracy can either go forward, evolve, reinvent itself, or go backwards. And that is the kind of historical lesson that John Dryzek reflected on already 3 decades ago. Now, look at the kind of challenges that democratic governance around the world is facing. I've picked just a few, some of the big ones, but there are plenty more, of course. If you think about any of these trends, any of these technological challenges, social, economic challenges, institutions, in order to cope with this kind of challenge, need 2 elements. They need legitimacy. That means that people need to trust them, think that those institutions are credible, fair, inclusive, reflective of the priorities of the population. So that's the legitimacy bit. But they also need the other side of the coin, which is capacity to act, to get things done. Capacity to mobilize resources, to construct policies, to innovate, to develop new types of services and arrangements, to be able to govern the economy effectively. So all these things are matters of capacity, being able to get things done. And a lot of people are beginning to be disappointed on either of those 2 sides. Some people think that a lot of our democratic institutions are losing legitimacy. You can't trust them. You can't really believe that they're inclusive, or that they don't have capacity. Yet they cannot get things done. We cannot address a lot of the issues of our time. Take, for example, the question of the climate emergency. Very little faith in governments when you look, for example, across the G20 countries survey that Ipsos did last year. This is leading to some forms of extreme pessimism. Some people think, well, this is it, so let it be. It might all collapse. What we need to now think about is, what do we put in place so that then we can rebuild after environmental collapse? Right? And a lot of people, there's a whole movement now and a whole scholarly field that looks at that. You know, how do we construct a better end of the world so that then we're in a good place to reconstruct after absolute catastrophe? Now, even if you don't buy that scenario, even if you don't believe that things are going to get that bad over the next 40, 50, 70, 80 years, the one thing that is undeniable, and most projections really kind of hammered home, is the fact that however the climate emergency pans out, is going to generate all kinds of social unrest and states of emergency, floods, wildfires, forced migration, homelessness, hunger, disease, violence. These things, some of them we are already seeing in parts of the world. There are already around 300 million climate refugees in the world, right? So even if the worst case scenarios don't happen, even if we manage to pull back from the brink, there are all kinds of things that are going to challenge our democratic institutions and the way we govern ourselves. Now, of course, legitimacy and capacity, as 2 key pillars of democratic governance, they can form a vicious circle. If you don't have legitimacy to act, then you cannot mobilize the capacity to act. You cannot mobilize the resources, the pulling together, the people and the money and whatever you need to get things done, right? But also, if you don't have capacity to act, then you lose legitimacy, right? You might have capacity to act, you have resources, but people don't trust you. And if you don't have those resources and you cannot get things done, you lose the trust as well. So it can be a vicious circle. It can also be a virtuous circle. And throughout history, we have seen democracies achieving the virtuous circle, where they have legitimacy and that allows them to mobilize capacity to get things done. Now, here's important to remind ourselves of a warning. As the gentleman earlier reminded us, this key moment where Nazism was kind of about to lead us into the Second World War. Now, at that very point in time, a very similar debate to the one we are having today was happening between a number of thinkers and activists and scholars. One of them was John Dewey, who was an American pragmatist and educator. And he made the case repeatedly in many different forums and instances and policy spaces that we cannot protect democracy if democracy is seen as only something that happens in certain spaces that are populated by elites. Unless democracy becomes part of everyday life, part of the way we think about our relationships, the way we live in our neighborhoods, the way we operate in our workplaces, the way we relate to each other in regions, nations, transnationally, unless it becomes a form of life, democracy is insecure. It's the point I made earlier. It's easy to topple if it's driven from the top. You change the top, and then you drive the machinery, right? If it's embedded in everyday life, in the way we organize our relationships more widely, then it's harder to take over. Now, when we think of democracy, in reality, democracies have different dimensions. The dimension that we often kind of get exposed to is electoral democracy. And you know the deal. There are elections, party politics, and elite competition for our votes to see who is best placed to represent the population. And then we delegate to representatives to make decisions on our behalf, right? To make decisions, to pass those decisions to officials so that then they can get things done, right? That is the theory behind this. And the core logic of this aspect of democracy is aggregation. You aggregate the population preferences through the vote, and that expresses where our priorities should be going, depending on how political parties articulate that on the back of that aggregation of the vote. But there are other dimensions to democracy. There's a participatory model or dimension of democracy, which has gained prominence since the 60s onwards, and that places more emphasis on participation in other spheres of life. The core practice here is mobilization, self-organizing, autonomous organizing, capacity to work in more horizontal ways and organize organizations and institutions in ways that are more democratic. And then, a few years later, another strand of democratic theory gained prominence. Now, these are both strands of democratic theory, but also dimensions of democratic practice that we already see to some level in every democratic country. And the third one is what we call deliberative democracy, which from the 80s onwards has put the spotlight on communication dynamics in the public sphere. It has to do with the network society changes that we saw on Monday. It has to do as well with large-scale mass media communication environments in our democracies. But it also has to do with the proliferation of misinformation, disinformation, and manipulation, and how authentic communication is necessary in order to tackle those, right? So the core practice here is deliberation and the force of the better argument as the fundamental driving force behind decisions. Now, why is it so important to emphasize participation beyond aggregation? Because of course when you vote, you're participating, but it's a logic of participation that goes as far as placing your vote and your trust in a group of people that then you empower to go and make decisions on your behalf. But that's become, if it ever was easy, now it has become even more difficult. Because when you vote for a political party, you might like some of the things that they are proposing. You might not like the whole package. And by the way, manifestos can never include everything that is going to happen during a legislature. So how do you get a mandate to act on things you couldn't even see when you put out the manifesto, right? So it's based on trust. We need to trust our representatives, and that is, at the moment, undermined. So participatory and deliberative Democrats, they argue that although aggregation might seem neutral, one person, one vote, which again, not all electoral systems actually do that. Most don't, they are distorted. May look neutral, but in practice it tends to serve the powerful. Those who have the resources to mobilize, to lobby, to push political parties in a particular direction. And this creates exclusion, and it can overlook differences and conflicts, and especially the predicament of those most marginalized. So this kind of points us to some fundamental political theory and political philosophy concepts, right? Because what does it mean to be free to participate? For some people, it means to have negative freedom. That means as long as I'm left alone, that's okay. That's as far as my rights need to go, right? I just want to have a lack of a formal kind of restriction on me. I want to have formal rights, and then I'll find my way in life to exercise them. And then there are those who say, well, we need to go beyond that. We also need positive freedom. It's not enough to have the vote nominally. You also need to then make sure that materially people have the kind of basic living standards that allows them to participate as citizens in society, including voting, right? So these are different conceptions that then come through depending on whether you're more of a participatory Democrat, an electoral Democrat, or deliberative Democrat. And already 20 years ago, when Dalton was looking at some of the democratic challenges ahead for the new century, one of the things that came across in his studies, and these are global studies of opinion across different countries in the world, he already told us that, look, you might think that it's just about improving elections, improving political parties, getting better political leaders. But if you think that that's enough, you're not understanding what's happening with citizens across the world. They're expecting more. They're expecting more influence, more control. They're expecting decision-making processes that are more inclusive. And the existing machinery is not necessarily going to provide that. So this is where participatory Democrats started to build their contemporary argument for participation in democracy. And the idea is not that everyone should participate in everything all the time. We don't have the time to do that or the inclination. But it should happen frequently enough that we feel that we are broadly shaping the issues that are most important to us. And our institutions need to be designed for that purpose. Now, if you have a more instrumental take on democracy, if what matters to you is not the values and questions of equality, questions of legitimacy, etc., but questions of effectiveness, instrumental reasons, there are also a number of reasons for participation that you will find in the empirical literature and in debates about these issues. So participation is seen to help to counter democratic deficits, to try and bring new knowledge, new expertise, new experience so that we can address the complexity of the problems we're facing. It is about making better policies and decisions because you can boost legitimacy, capacity, you can improve the way you design services, and so on. And yes, it also has a more normative dimension of building trust and collaboration, social cohesion, and developing communities that have and develop the skills, confidence, and capacity to make a difference. So this leads to two stories that you will find in political science about citizens in the 21st century. On the one hand, you will have a school that is what we call the kind of school of decline. Democracy is declining, citizenship is declining, voting turnout is going down generally, with exceptions, of course. Trust and legitimacy of traditional institutions is being eroded. Social capital is being lost. And then on the other hand, you will have those who have a more positive kind of reading. People like Pippa Norris and many other political scientists you will come across. They are showing that what's happening is that people are becoming better educated, more knowledgeable, more critical, less deferential to traditional authority, and more skeptical of traditional channels. And they are looking for new forms of political expression and democratic life. Now, often when I work with politicians, when I work with policymakers, when I get to work on these democratic innovations that you're going to see later as we are designing these things in different countries around the world, the question that always comes up when we start to collaborate is the question of public apathy. Oh, but do people really want to participate? Right? People are apathetic. And here's the interesting thing. Apathy is not a human trait. It's not something natural to us. Apathy takes a lot of hard work to construct. And arguably, we've built democracies that are really good at building apathy on an industrial scale. But people are not apathetic about the way they choose to associate and participate in movements or commit to a particular issue or campaign, or the way they spend their money, the way they choose their circles, the way they engage in public discourse. There are plenty. Look at Scotland, just as an example. In the aftermath of the financial crisis, we saw a massive rise in civic participation. There was obviously the record-breaking participation in the independence referendum, but there's also a growing, really extremely vibrant level of civil society activity. The world of social enterprise in Scotland is one of the most prominent anywhere in the world. The Community Development Trusts movement, with over 400 across Scotland. All kinds of community ownership initiatives, community wealth building programs. So apathy is a myth. It's just that if you go looking for participation in the traditional spaces, you will think that people are not doing things and are not mobilizing and trying to change things, because that's going to escape your radar, all this level of political activity in other spheres of life. So now, you might be wondering, okay, so what's the difference between a more participatory democracy and a more deliberative democracy? So here's the thing. Traditional forms of participation are problematic, right? Sometimes what you get through some forms of participation is people participating with the like-minded. And that can be really good if it's a particular cause or campaign and you're trying to achieve some level of justice on an issue. But then for broader issues of governance or policy making, you need a cross-section of the population involved. Because otherwise you have groupthink, you have echo chambers, you have all kinds of polarization dynamics. And then also some traditional forms of participation are not necessarily allowing enough space for citizens to explore issues, investigate issues, examine evidence before they get to participate. So that brings irrationality into decision making. So deliberative democracy is based on a simple idea, actually. It's the idea that decisions should be based on reasoned public deliberation, where the only force that matters is not the force of money or how many people support you, but the force of the better argument. If your argument for this particular line of action is better, because it's a better appeal to justice or a better appeal to achieving good outcomes for people, then it doesn't matter that you are one person amongst 10. You should carry forward with the force of the better argument, and eventually, in a deliberative democracy, that's what will come up on top. Of course, we know that that's not necessarily the case out there. But the point is that deliberative democrats think that democracy should be more than just counting heads. How many people support this? How many people support that? It should be about people making sense of the challenges they face, talking to each other, trying to work out their differences, trying to understand each other's perspectives. So more like a forum where you gather and try to make sense of something before coming to a conclusion, rather than a market where you just aggregate preferences and leave it to others to articulate that through traditional political institutions. And you might be wondering, what do you mean by deliberation? This is a very particular form of communication that is pretty special because it's very difficult, and it's difficult to accomplish. It's a form of communication where you invite people to reflect with an open mind, to try and be really attentive to evidence and reasons, to justify the positions they are taking. So no more just party line, trust me, this is the right thing, but justify it, give me the arguments behind it. And then respectful of others' perspectives so that you can then understand why they are coming at it from a different perspective and see if they may have, they may have a point that makes you change your preferences. Now, this is really difficult in a society where we have become so accustomed to the politics of a spectacle, right? But this is the kind of ideal that deliberative democrats are pushing us to strive towards. So the basic notion is that deliberation should be the foundation for public action. Decisions are legitimate insofar people are allowed to shape those decisions through public deliberation under equal conditions. And this is not just about public opinion, and this is the key difference with electoral democracy. In a deliberative democracy, it's not just public opinion, it's public reasoning. This is based on the notion that we are not just individual packages of preferences to be aggregated. We discover what we think, the kind of world that we want to live in, the kind of things that matter to us when we engage in conversation with others. That's how we make sense of things. So it's not enough to aggregate. You need to allow people to talk to each other, to try and understand where we're coming from, to try and build a sense of what the common good may look like. And behind this theory is an attempt at creating transformative dynamics by correcting misinformation, disinformation, misrepresentation, by trying to clear the ground from manipulative arguments, and by trying to realize a number of democratic goods, right? So this is the theory, and this has pretty much taken over democratic theory, particularly in the last 20 years. Is probably the fastest growing sort of aspect of democratic theory and one of the most vibrant in the last 20 years. But you might be wondering, okay, how does that translate into practice? Okay, this is where the field of democratic innovation comes in. This is where we move towards institutions that are trying to translate those participatory and deliberative ideals into practices. Practices of governance, sometimes nationwide governance or transnational governance or community-based governance, depending on different levels of governance. And it is a field that has a long history. We could keep going back in history, but I like to start in 1920 with Mary Parker Follett, who was a pioneer in this kind of thinking. Of course, a lot of that was lost with the rise of authoritarianism, but it was picked up back again in the 60s, Carol Pateman and many others building on that. And then it kind of galvanized around 2009. This is really where most people will place the current wave of democratic innovation, with the book by Graham Smith. There has been a lot of work since then. It's the largest, the second largest group in the European Consortium for Political Research, because there's so much going on in democratic innovation that the scholarly community is trying to respond to practices on the ground. And this gives you just a little proxy to see how this pans out and how it is reflected in publications. There is a clear kind of shift up at the turn of the century. Now, at the heart of this space of practice is the notion that depending on what kind of processes and institutions we design, then we're going to get different types of citizens. Citizens have the capacity to be complainers, reactionaries, bystanders, spectators. Those are the roles that often get in electoral democracies. Or they have the potential to be co-productive citizens. They have the potential to be problem solvers, thinkers, co-producers. And it depends on what kind of institutions you design. If you are just asking them for reaction and complain, you're going to get a particular type of input. If you are asking them to think carefully, deliberate, and then put forward options, then you're going to get a different type of outcome, right? And the key question then is, what kind of citizen are we inviting citizens to be? The kind of thin citizenship of traditional electoral democracy, or the thicker citizenship that comes with complementing electoral democracy with participatory and deliberative institutions as well. So democratic innovations are processes or institutions that are seeking to reimagine and deepen the role of citizens in democratic governance by increasing participation, deliberation, and influence. Now, that's the kind of definition that we now have in the field. But how does the practice look like? So I'm going to give you 3 examples and then get towards the conclusions. I've chosen these because there's so much material on them, and some of them might be known to you, but there are many, many more. There are hundreds, probably thousands of different types of processes and institutions that we could classify as democratic innovations. I'm choosing some of the ones that have become quite popular in the last few years. Starting with mini-publics. I don't know if you heard about this. They go by different names. There are different types, right? It's a large family. Citizens' assemblies, citizens' duties, consensus conferences, and so on and so forth. But they all share something in common. They are selected through civic lottery, like for jury duty, so that there is no self-selection bias. And therefore you can get a cross-section of the population in the process. Some of the richest and some of the poorest. Some of the most formally educated, people who never got a chance to get a formal education. People of all kinds, people of all kind of demographics, and trying to really have a cross-section of the population in the space, in the process, in the forum. There have been lots of mini-publics, but if you think about it, I mean, you know, the estimate by the OECD is around 800. That's not a lot, to be honest, compared to all the decision-making processes that go on through traditional institutions. So it's still an emerging field, although it has been around now for a few decades. Now we're in a phase where they are being institutionalized. So there are places like Belgium, in the German-speaking region of Belgium, where the elected parliament has a parallel citizen parliament that is selected through lottery, and it has its own powers, right? The city of Paris also has a permanent citizens' assembly, and there are others just now emerging. In the UK, we are developing proposals to see how this could be built into the 4 parliaments. Some examples, some of them you might have come across. The most famous ones are the ones in Ireland, where you might remember a few years ago, the referendums on equal marriage and reproductive rights. Before those referendums, there were 2 very high-profile citizens' assemblies that did a lot of the deliberative work. Then there have been a lot of climate assemblies, so I'll come back to that. I want to show you a couple of examples. Let's start with the local level. At the local level, this has been done a few years, but it's an interesting one because it was a mix between randomly selected citizens through civic lottery and business owners, because that community was a key stakeholder in the process, because the new legislation, the new proposals were going to affect business rates and so on. This citizens panel was given the job of plugging a 1.2 billion gap in a 5 billion plan. And they were given some basic parameters by the municipality, and then they were given the possibility of engage local communities more broadly. So it's not always just about the mini public at the center. There is like a hub and spokes type of thing, where you kind of feed from networks as well. They concluded with a 10-year financial plan that reflected the 11 recommendations, and you can go to the city of Melbourne and see how those were implemented over the years, for example, right? Then take, for example, in Colombia, a really innovative model of mini-public, the itinerant citizens' assembly, that work to try and deal with a number of urban issues, urban challenges, some of them to do with infrastructure, some of them with exclusion and poverty. Again, same principle. You have randomly selected citizens. You then provide them with the time and the resources to examine evidence, to listen to different perspectives from activists, from business people, from academics, from whoever is relevant to hear on a given issue. And then you give them the chance to deliberate and reach conclusions that they can justify, that they can inform on the basis of the perspectives and evidence that they have examined. Another one in Canada, this finished last year. They were trying to use a mini-public to try and cope and come up with some options for how we are going to do the governance of digital technology over the next few years. Again, the same logic, a mini-public, taking the time to engage with this. Now, mini-publics can last anything between 1 day and 2 years, right? They are really diverse depending on the topic. Sometimes you need a long time to examine an issue. So obviously the cost of them goes up and down depending on that. And then in the UK and Scotland, we have been doing these things as well. You might have come across the UK Climate Assembly with David Attenborough kind of involved and giving it a little bit of visibility. You might have come across the demands that XR and Fridays for Future have been making over the years for citizens' assemblies. And here on this Zoom mosaic, this is the Scottish Climate Assembly that we had a few years back. These are just some pictures of how these things look like internally. This was in Glasgow in the first Citizens' Assembly of Scotland. Now you can check these things out. There are lots of videos and evidence out there, and you can see the evidence sessions, how they, you know, how the kind of things that the participants engage with. But this is not just local and national level. We now have as well experiments at global level, including the Global Assembly, which is taking shape just now in parallel to COP in Brazil. So this aims to apply the same logic, but to the entire world. And there has already been a precedent in 2021 during the pandemic. And it was really interesting because how do you get a cross-section of the entire world population? And how do you conduct a process of this kind in 40 or 50 different languages with simultaneous translation, right? So real technical challenges as well as democratic challenges. Now, if you want to learn a little bit more about climate assemblies, we are launching our book next week, and it's an open access book. You can download the PDF, and if you want, join us for the launch, which is going to be online. Now, a second example, participatory budgeting. This is a very different type of democratic innovation. The focus here is how do you give citizens direct power over budgets? Can citizens make good decisions when you allow them to channel public finance, right? This started in Brazil, in the city of Porto Alegre. It has now spread across the world to over 70 countries, I think it is by now, over 11,000 localities. Some of the high-profile cases in Europe are Madrid and Paris, Madrid until recently. And in Scotland, in 2010, had about 6 or 7 PV processes. By now, it has over 400 across the country. Sometimes the money is really large, like in the Brazilian cases, up to $500 million a year in some cities. In some cases, it's very small. In Scotland, it's the smaller type of budget. But the reason PV became a really compelling example is because of the effects it had where it originated, in Porto Alegre in Brazil, where it shifted resources towards the poorest families in the cities. It created education and health services for populations that were underserved before. It created new infrastructure, running water, pavements. It reduced spending, administrative costs, because it increased trust as well between residents and officials, so you could reduce bureaucracy. And it included anything up to 50,000 participants on any given year with a really good representation of disadvantaged groups. Over time, it then spread across Brazil, and now we can measure over the last 30 years decreasing health inequalities, reductions in infant mortality, all kinds of interesting things. So a very different type of process. In Europe, one of the largest was the Madrid case, which was digital. So you could participate through a platform that had 400,000 registered participants, and it lasted until 2019, when there was a change of administration and the new administration got rid of it, which can happen with democratic innovations if they are not built as institutions, but as interventions by a particular administration, right? And finally, our final example, digital crowdsourcing. I wanted to bring something that is quite different. So I'm just going to give you a couple of examples here. One of the pioneers was Open Ministry in Finland, although it's no longer in place, but it was quite ambitious. They were trying to create a digital infrastructure for crowdsourcing legislation, and they were combining participatory, deliberative, and representative logics as part of the system they developed. But more famous is the case of Taiwan and Iceland. So I'm going to pause a little bit more on those. But before that, the one thing you need to know about digital infrastructure is that it can produce a lot of really bad stuff. And I'm sure you have all kinds of ideas about how social media and how certain platforms are really undermine politics, democracy, and so on. But there are other forms of digital participation. And a lot of the digital democratic innovations are based on this notion of collective intelligence. And experiments in all kinds of contexts that show that a crowd tends to be smarter than the smartest person in the crowd, as long as it's cognitively diverse, it has independent thinkers, and good facilitation and deliberation. If you have those conditions, you will have a smart crowd, a digital collective. If you don't have those conditions, you will get a digital herd, a dynamic of followers that just follow, say, a populist authoritarian leader, for example. It's the difference between autonomous citizenship and elite-driven followership. The case of Iceland is very well known because this is how Iceland created a new constitution after the financial crash. There was a citizens' assembly, well, first demonstrations on the streets, then a 1,000 citizens' assembly, then a citizen council chosen through elections, so combining participation, deliberation, and representation, and then a new constitution. That, of course, then went to a referendum and got passed, but then there was a change of administration, and that constitution is still waiting to really go forward. So here you see a pattern of how existing institutions can clash with democratic innovations. If you want to see more on this, read Helen Landmore. Her book is really good on this stuff, Open Democracy. And then we have V-Taiwan, just the final example I'm bringing. V-Taiwan became quite famous because during the pandemic, Taiwan was one of the places where the pandemic was managed relatively okay compared to most of the world. Some would say far, far better than places like the UK. If you are to take into account the number of people who were tragically dead, there is no question that Taiwan did better than most countries. A big part of that was to do with digital infrastructure, digital crowdsourcing, and the kind of trust between institutions and citizens. So that was a key moment of visibility, but this had started earlier in 2014 with the Sunflower Movement and a new kind of era that brought digital activists into government to kind of reform the way they did governance. And they set up a whole new system, including this AI-powered platform called Polis that tries to create and generate levels of consensus across large crowds. So it's a complex system. I can't go into the detail. It has many issues and flaws, and actually, as we speak, its momentum has gone down. So democratic innovation is not linear or straightforward. It encounters a lot of resistance, but there are some really powerful experiences that show the potential. Now, if you want to see more cases, check the Wikipedia for participatory nerds. It's called Participedia, and there is also the Latin American version, Latino. Now, let's finish just reflecting on some challenges. Democratic innovation requires changing the way we think, and it changes the way politicians, officials, activists need to see themselves as no longer driving things, but actually following the lead of citizens who are put at the driving seat, right? It requires a facilitative form of leadership. Leadership not the kind of authoritative leadership that says, I know everything, follow me, because that's no longer tenable or workable or credible, right? No one has all the solutions. It's the leadership that says, look, I might not have the answers, but I know how to put in place a process by which collectively we are going to work out the answers. It also requires that we recognize that there are all kinds of inequalities of power and influence within communities. So this is not straightforward. It comes with many challenges and problems. There are all kinds of things around the astroturfing industry, fake movements, fake forms of participation. And then it takes a lot of investment. Essentially, we need to rewire our institutions, build new capacity, new skills, build new infrastructure so that we can carry out these kind of processes and build these new types of institutions. But now we're beginning to work out some of these things, and we're beginning to understand some of the synergies and some of the tensions between traditional institutions and these new emerging democratic innovations. So, to conclude, there is a global democratic recession, but there is also a whole world of democratic innovation. This is recognizing that democracy cannot stand still. We need to keep trying, develop new forms. We need to understand that it cannot just be left to elections. They can no longer carry the full weight of democratic responsibility. They remain important, political parties remain important, but they need help. We need help from new types of institutions. In many ways, this is a field of utopian pragmatism, because it is utopian because it invites us to think beyond what we can imagine now, right? Beyond the horizon of possibilities that is in our imagination at the moment. But it's not naive, it's pragmatist, because we know that we need to learn as we go, and it's going to be about constant learning and adaptation. What is clear is that citizens, when they are given the right spaces and opportunities, they have the capacity to grapple with very complex issues. That's no longer under doubt. We've tested this endlessly, but they need the right types of spaces. And we are going to have to do this in a hurry, because we have a window of opportunity of about 10 years to rewire our institutions so that we can cope with what's coming in terms of climate disruption and technological disruption. So, thank you for listening to that whistle tour, and I hope I'll see some of you in year 3, if not before.